Photoshop 2020 offers a very tiny enhancement to the lens blur filter that Adobe is super excited about, so I'm going to show it to you. Now, if you're familiar with the lens blur filter, you know it exists here in the filter menu under the blur submenu, and it allows you to simulate a shallow depth of field by applying a very natural blur, much like you might achieve in camera. However, so does this filter right here, Field Blur. Does a very good job as well. And the advantage of Field Blur to this day is that you can apply it to a smart object. That is not the case with Lens Blur. Lens Blur remains one of the very few filters inside Photoshop 2020 as well that you cannot assign as an editable smart filter. However, I am going to show you how it works because one of its advantages is that you can assign a depth map that tells Photoshop which areas are in and out of focus using an alpha channel. And so here I am looking at that selection outline that I created back in Chapter 1 using the Object Selection tool. And in case you're working along with me, you can get to that selection by going up to the Window menu and choosing the Channels command, which brings up the Channels panel, complete with this alpha channel that I've created in advance. And you can load that guy up by pressing the Control key or the Command key on the Mac and clicking on it like so. That's all there is to it. Now we need to create another alpha channel that has blurred edges so that we have some better contouring. And I'll do that by dropping down to this icon right here, the one that reads Save Selection as Channel. And just so I can name the channel as I create it, I will press the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and click on that icon. And I'll call this guy G-Blur 12.0 because I'm going to be applying the Gaussian blur filter. All right, I'll go ahead and click OK. And then I'll press Control D or Command D on the Mac to deselect the image. And I'll switch to that new G-Blur channel just by clicking on it. And then I'll go up to the filter menu, choose blur, and choose Gaussian blur. And you may wonder why I'm not applying lens blur because that comes in the next step. Gaussian blur is what you want when you're trying to soften a mask. And so I'll go ahead and choose that command and notice that I've cranked the radius value up to 12 pixels. So we have a goodly amount of blur here. And then I'll go ahead and click OK. All right, now I'll switch back to the RGB composite image. I'll switch back to the layers panel as well. And because I want to be able to apply this blur across the image, I'm going to merge these two channels by pressing Control-Shift-Alt-E. That's Command-Shift-Option-E on the Mac. So mash your fist E. That'll create a merged version of all visible layers. And then I'll just go ahead and rename this guy Merged. And now, as I say, normally before I apply a filter, I would convert it to a smart object, but you can't do that in this case because notice now, if I go to the filter menu and choose blur, that lens blur is dimmed. All right, so I'll go ahead and undo the creation of that smart object just by pressing Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac. And with this independent layer, so that'll give me a little flexibility, I'll go up to the filter menu, choose blur, and choose lens blur. And that's going to bring up this big, huge dialog box right here. And you can adjust the radius to taste. For example, I could take it up to 20, let's say. You can play with the blade curvature, the rotation, the shape of your aperture, and all that jazz if you want to. But instead, what I'm going to do is add some specular highlights using this option right here. So I can take this threshold value up to, let's say, 160, by the way. And then I'll take the brightness value up as well so that we can see where our specular highlights are occurring. And I'm going to set that guy to 40, let's say. And then you can adjust the threshold as you like. If you take the threshold up, you'll see that you're getting fewer specular highlights. But as I say, I'm going to leave that set to 160 just so that I'm bringing out the bubbles. I don't really want to blur Colleen's face and hands and so forth, which is why I have the depth map. And so I'm going to set this source option right here to G-Blur 12. And just for the sake of demonstration, I'll start with it set to Diver, which is the one that's not blurred. But notice what's happening is I'm blurring Colleen and I'm not blurring the background. And so you can change that by modifying this blur focal distance value. What you'd want to do is crank it all the way up to 255 so that white is protected, not affected. Or you can select this new Set Focal Point tool. So go ahead and click on it. If it's not a reactive, I just deactivated it. So I'll click on it again. And now I'll move my cursor into the image preview and I'll click inside Colleen to make sure that she's focused and the background is not focused. That's your new feature, by the way. All right, so I'm going to zoom in just by control clicking or command clicking on the Mac. And notice we have some pretty sharp edges between the focused and non-focused areas of the image, which is why I'm going to change that source channel to GBlur 12.0 right there. And now we have some soft edges. And so it's a little bit of a hack because these hoses wouldn't really be this out of focus. If I wanted to do a better job, then I would spend more time on that alpha channel. But I figure this is good enough for now, at which point I'll go ahead and click OK in order to accept that change. And just like that, we have a lens blur. Now, I actually want these bubbles here to be in sharper focus, so I'm going to add a layer mask to this new layer by dropping down to the Add Layer Mask icon and clicking on it. And then I'll go ahead and select my brush tool, which you can get by pressing the B key. You want to make sure your foreground color is set to black, and you can get that by pressing the D key in order to instate the default foreground and background colors, in which case the foreground color is white because I'm working on a mask. And then I'll press the X key to swap them so that black is my foreground color. Then I'll right-click inside the image window, make sure the hardness value is 0%, and I'm going to go ahead and crank the size value up to 500, let's say, so that we have a big brush. And I'll just go ahead and brush back in those bubbles up here near the top of the image. And if you want, you can brush a little bit around the hoses as well so that they're not totally blurry. And you can bring back the hand a little bit, but if you do, let me just zoom in there. Notice that I clicked on the hand in order to mask it away, but that brings back some sharper transitions in the background as well. So I'll just go ahead and press Control Z or Command Z on the Mac to undo that change. And I could paint more carefully if I wanted to inside that layer mask. However, I'm just going to leave it as is. And so here's the difference. This is the original photograph with the sharply focused coral down here in particular near the bottom of the image. And this is the result of the ever so slightly improved lens blur filter here inside Photoshop 2020.